Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Bruce Levine, and we're going to get into Bruce's work around Thaddeus Stevens, and we'll discuss Stevens, Reconstruction, maybe a few other subjects as well. First off, Bruce, thanks so much for coming on. I was hoping you could introduce yourself, including your political background, and then how you also developed an interest in Civil War era history and in Stevens.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Luke. I'm happy to be here. I always say I had a career before academia. I grew up in the era of the civil rights movement, was active in the movement to end the war in Vietnam, and became very active politically, even in high school, around issues like that, U.S. foreign policy. And I was around during the invasion of the Dominican Republic, 1965. Things like that infuriated me and drove me further and further into what we call radical politics. But I eventually became a professional historian and was trained, in fact, as a labor historian by Herb Gutman at the University of Rochester and later at the City University of New York. And so I wrote a dissertation about the German immigrants of the 1848 revolution era and how that revolution had influenced them and how it influenced those who came to the United States and how they perceived the struggle that was then already cresting over slavery. But the focus was on laboring people from Germany because I was a labor historian, and I had remained a labor historian until the subject of the struggle against slavery exerted such a pull over my mind that it basically yanked me from being a labor historian into being a historian of slavery, emancipation, the Civil War that accomplished that, and so on. It seemed to me, especially as the labor movement retreated in our time, a more vital and fruitful area to study. And it remains a great interest to me, of course.
Do you remember folks in the late 60s, 70s, the period you were discussing, talking about Thaddeus Stevens, talking about Reconstruction, the radical Republicans, or was this more history that you really came to after?
I don't remember hearing very much of that in the various movements I was involved in. It was in college and in the classroom that I began to learn more about these things. There was a strong anti intellectual strain in the radical movements of the 60s and 70s, especially the 60s. And it was especially pronounced not in a current that I was involved in, but those who eventually became the Weathermen and who disrupted left-wing organizations, especially the Students for Democratic Society, were aggressively anti-intellectual. Nothing that had occurred earlier than their lifetime was apparently of relevance to anything going on today. And those of us who thought it was were basically hooted down. But I was lucky enough to take a course at Michigan by a Professor William Toll on what was called Black history. And the syllabus included Du Bois's book on Reconstruction, Black Reconstruction in America, and a book by James McPherson called The Negro's Civil War, which introduced me to Frederick Douglass and Thaddeus Stevens. And I was off and running at that point because I had never really understood the significance of the political struggle against slavery and the role of African Americans in particular in that struggle and in the Civil War itself. And I grew fascinated by that subject. And that in turn, Stevens became a hero of mine. And that fascination drew me further and further into the study of the radical Republicans of which he was a part. And I had long hoped to write a book about Thaddeus Stevens. But when I got ready to write it, it turned out that another historian was getting ready to do so as well and was further along in preparing for it. And so I backed off until he told me a few years later that he changed his mind, was going to do something else. And so the road was clear.
At the time you published your book, it had been a little while since there was a biography of Stevens.
The most recent one prior to that was Hans Dreyfus's Thaddeus Stevens, 19th century egalitarian. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the year that it appeared, but it was not very recent.
I know a lot of the conversation around your book or the little bits I've seen have included phrases like much needed. I don't think anyone says about time, but it's needed.
Well, Eric Foner was kind enough to say that it was the biography that Stevens deserved.
Well, let's get over to Stevens. Let's dive into his life. He was born in Vermont in 1792, and you discuss his history, but also the state's history, the environment in which he grew up. So I was curious if you could talk about Vermont's history, its state constitution.
Sure. It's something that I discovered that nobody who had written biographies of Stevens, and there have been quite a few such biographies, had paid very much attention to. But the more I read about it and the more I looked into it, the more important it seemed to me that it was in shaping his early years. He lived in Vermont throughout his childhood, his youth, and until he went to college. And I think that could not help but have an influence on him. So, to answer your question directly, this was a piece of land in North America that was claimed in the colonial era by both New Hampshire and New York, those two colonies. And New Hampshire would issue land grants on pretty easy terms to would be farmers. And New York State issued, or rather, the New York colony issued much more restrictive and onerous grants. The rents were higher, the colony exercised greater control over this area of North America, also denied the legitimacy of New Hampshire land grants, and instead granted some of that same terrain to New Yorkers, who then came into what eventually calls itself Vermont and tried to stake out their own claims, overlapping those of the New Englanders. The New Englanders weren't having any of that. And there was a major, lengthy, years-long struggle on the part of the New Englanders to defend their land and to defend their small farms. And when it became time that the American Revolution began, Vermont was not one of the original members of the United States. It was for some time an independent republic of Vermont, whose name derives from the French term for the Green Mountains that runs down the middle of the state. Vermont fights alongside of the other North American colonies for independence from Britain, eventually does become admitted into the United States, despite the resistance of what becomes New York State, who still is attempting to assert control over that piece of land. And it becomes time to adopt the state constitution, as all the other ex-colonies are then doing. But there are various kinds of constitutions being adopted at the state level in those days, some more democratic than others. New York State does not adopt a very democratic constitution. And by democratic, people like Stevens' family meant constitutions in which the legislature, number one, had primary power. If there was a governor at all, the governor was weak, and small r Republicans in those era looked upon the executive power with a baleful eye, thought of it as survival of monarchism, and did not want a single individual to exercise extraordinary power. They wanted legislators to exercise that power because they believed that the legislators were closer to the electorate, were closer to the population. And they also wanted short terms of office so that office holders would have to come back more frequently for the renewed approval of the population. That's the kind of constitution that Vermont winds up adopting. It's basically, if I remember correctly, Vermont and Pennsylvania were the two states that adopt these much more democratic constitutions. The other thing that the Vermont Constitution does, and which no other state constitution does, is explicitly denounce chattel slavery. And it's written into the Constitution. Abolition is not in the Constitution, but a political denunciation of slavery is in that Constitution. And that in turn reflects the widespread hostility to slavery that was common in Vermont in that era.
Discussing the Vermont Constitution is really interesting. I'm more familiar with the Pennsylvania Constitution, and I've had discussions with folks about Tom Paine and the influence of Paine on that Constitution. But I think it's a little known, or at least it's a very inspiring bit of U.S. history, the variety of state constitutions that there were. Some of them, as you said, were not very democratic. Some of them, I think we could say, were more democratic than the federal constitution than we got.
Unquestionably. And so, as others pointed out, the spirit that shaped Vermont in that early era, an emphasis on the defense of the small farmer and the small farmer's family, the defense of the rights of the population, lived on after the Vermont region enters the United States. And that is the political atmosphere in which Thaddeus Stevens grows up.
How did his abolitionist politics develop? How did abolitionism become a key part of his life?
Well, I think there are a number of influences here, and historians have speculated for a long time about which of these influences was primary. Some have seen the fact that he was born with a clubbed foot as the source of his lifelong identification with the disadvantaged of all types, people, the underdog, so to speak. And there's no question, it seems to me, that that was a sore subject with him as a child, and he was sensitive about it. And it may very well have contributed to his ultimate sympathy with not only the poor, but also the slaves. He also did grow up, speaking of being poor, in an impoverished family. And it seems pretty clear that also disposed him to sympathize with other individuals who did not enjoy the advantages of the wealthy and the politically powerful. His mother was very religious, and he grew up in the Baptist denomination. Well, the Baptist denomination in those days, especially in the North, was a very democratic-minded Protestant sect, which had been persecuted in England and remained sensitive and cognizant of that history of persecution. Emphasized, therefore, the democratic notions that were common in Vermont as a whole. So here's this sort of over-determination. In the case of Stevens, he's got that democratic impulse from the state as a whole, and now he's also got it from the religion of his mother, and his mother tried to impress the values of that religion upon Stevens. And although Stevens, as an adult, really is not a religious individual, though he does indeed believe in God, it's clear that these values that he drew from baptism, the rights of the individual, and so on, also were a contributing factor in what eventually becomes his abolitionism. But he's not an abolitionist as a young man, by which I mean somebody who is committed to the immediatist destruction of slavery. He almost certainly disliked slavery, but he didn't make it central to his thinking or his conduct. And even when he became an attorney, he separated his politics from his legal practice and not only defended fugitive slaves, but also defended a particular slave owner attempting to recapture a fugitive slave, a woman by the name of Charity Butler. And he succeeds in helping Butler's master, in the language of the day, to reclaim her in court. So it takes a while for Thaddeus Stevens to conclude that he needs to devote himself not to the recapture of fugitive slaves, but the defense of fugitive slaves. And one of the things that I think influences him is the degree to which slave owners become more and more aggressive in demanding not only that slavery survive, but that Northerners help them keep it alive. And the more aggressive they become on this score, the more people like Stevens draw back and begin to take a firmer stand against the slave owners, but also against the institution of slavery. And so by the mid-1830s, when basically Southern states are demanding specific actions on the part of Northern states to suppress the newly arising abolitionist movement, Thaddeus Stevens says, no, we don't do that. We are not slaves. You're not telling us what we can and can't talk about, because they wanted to suppress even discussion of slavery in the northern states and wanted the state governments of the northern states to enforce that prohibition. Stevens is the chairman of a committee in by now the Pennsylvania state legislature. He moves to Pennsylvania and becomes politically active, a subject we can return to if you like. And as a chairman of this committee, he drafts a response to Virginia's demand that he help enforce slavery and basically says, not only won't you tell us what we can and cannot talk about, but the report that he brings into the state legislature on behalf of that committee also denounces slavery, says that the federal Constitution, contrary to what the South is saying, has the right to prohibit slavery wherever the federal writ is strong, the District of Columbia, and especially the territories. And not only, says Stevens and his committee, does the federal government have the right to outlaw slavery there, it has the moral and political obligation to outlaw slavery there. And he says the fact that it has not exercised that power should be a source of shame.
The incursions that you talk about of the South increasingly into the North, I believe it's McPherson's battle cry of freedom for the first time that really gave me that sense of, certainly by the time the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, but even as you're talking about, well before then.
Absolutely. South Carolina and the nullification conflict. Bill Freeling wrote a very important book many, many years ago saying this nullification conflict that South Carolina initiates in the early 1830s is not primarily about a tariff. Underlying that, and he quotes the correspondence that the South Carolinians are writing to one another. Underlying this is a fear that if the federal government can pass a law like a tariff that contradicts the interests of South Carolinian slave owners, then the next thing they may do is pass a law explicitly attacking slavery. So let's stop this right now. Let's stop the federal government from ever being able to pass any law that interferes with the interests of South Carolinians. And so we declare the tariff null and void. And this, of course, leads to a famous confrontation between South Carolina and the federal government, which looks for a while like it's going to be a war, a violent conflict. But Andrew Jackson and the federal Congress settles it with South Carolina, but in return for South Carolina giving up on secession, or at least the threat of secession, and backing off from nullifying this law, people like Henry Clay agree to begin rolling back the tariff. And Thaddeus Stevens comes to consider this an enormous betrayal on the part of Henry Clay. Stevens is an absolute believer in Northern industry and whatever the youthful Northern industry requires to survive, including, as Henry Clay had always said, a tariff. I rush to say that the issue of the tariffs in the 1830s was worlds away from the issue of the tariff in 2025. The United States was an infant country struggling against a powerful England who had already industrialized and whose competition was threatening to prevent the United States from ever becoming anything more than an agricultural nation. And Thaddeus Stevens strongly believed in commerce and strongly believed in manufacturing. So he believed in the right to have a tariff. Henry Clay had always championed the tariff. So he sours on Henry Clay and also considers that the decision to make this concession to the South only encouraged the South in the future to repeatedly make threats in order to extract concessions from the North.
So all of this stuff is bubbling, boiling. And Stevens joins the Whig Party, I believe, in the early 1830s. And I was hoping if you could talk about the Whigs as a party, and then Stevens' relationship to the Whigs, and also what would eventually happen to the Whig Party.
The Whig Party was a more pro-capitalist party than the other major party that existed in the day. That was the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was really controlled by the slave-owning South. It had strong units in the North, composed at the rank and file level largely of people of middling and small property, but also merchants. But the South was very powerful in the Democratic Party in those days. The Whig Party also had, both parties existed in both North and South, but the Whig Party was strongest in the North, and it was the party of commerce and manufacturing. Thaddeus Stevens was attracted to the Whig Party undoubtedly in large part because of its economic program. They believed in the tariff, as I've now said repeatedly, but they also believed in a strong bank in order to make commerce occur more easily and to have a currency that was recognized throughout the country. which was not something to be assumed at that early stage of American history, to have federal monies allocated for the construction of what were called internal improvements, canals, bridges, roads, and eventually railroads. The South and the Democratic Party was opposed to all of this. And that was basically the principal term of the contest between the Whigs and the Democrats, was over these economic issues. But Whigs, in the North at least, many of them had the values of what was called a free labor society, which is a non-slave capitalist society in which labor was not enslaved. It was driven by economic compulsion to work for employers. And on the basis of slavery and on the basis of so-called free labor capitalism, different values grew up in the two parts of the country. And so while the Whigs were not an anti-slavery party, they contained a lot of people who were indeed anti-slavery, or at least disliked slavery. So that when the South begins aggressively to demand of the North that it make concessions to slavery, and especially when this starts to take a geographical form, as the United States increases its control over the Midwestern portion of the continent and eventually California, a wing of the Northern Whigs begin to oppose this. And so that resistance begins and is strongest in the Whig Party in the North, though there is even a wing of the Northern Democratic Party that resists that expansion. Push this whole story forward. This really comes to a head in 1850, after the United States had defeated Mexico in the war and basically swallowed up half of Mexico's national territory. So the question is then posed, is this huge chunk of new U.S. territory going to be open to slavery, or is it not? And a whole bunch of northern states pass resolutions demanding that slavery be outlawed in this part of the country. And the South demands, on the contrary, that slavery be legalized in these territories. Thaddeus Stevens takes a very strong stand against what becomes known as the Compromise of 1850, which makes major concessions to the South on this subject. It basically says that in at least part of this territory, the future of slavery will be decided by what's called popular sovereignty. That is to say, the white residents of that region will decide whether slavery is legal or not. And the Compromise of 1850 makes another concession to the South. It includes the passage of a new fugitive slave law, a fugitive slave law that makes it easier for self-identified masters who claim that their slaves have illegally escaped from them to recapture those slaves. And that law also requires all residents of the North, regardless of how they feel about slavery, to join whatever posse in action near them attempting to recapture an alleged fugitive. And this is extremely distasteful, as you can imagine, to a large number of Northerners. And Thaddeus Stevens is particularly biting in his denunciation, not only of the South for making this demand, but of Northern political leaders, including leaders of the Whig Party, who are prepared to make these concessions. But that stance gets Stevens in deep trouble with the Whig Party, including the Whig Party in his part of Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. And he is, for all intents and purposes, sidelined in the Whig Party at that point and is politically isolated within the Whig Party. So for years, abolitionists had been saying, we need a new political party. We need, because neither the Democrats nor the Whigs are going to fight to put an end to slavery. And Thaddeus Stevens would say, no, no, no. Like Lincoln, by the way, these two Whigs would say, for all intents and purposes, the Whig Party is already an anti-slavery party. See, we have in our state voted for this resolution calling for the territories to be free. Why do we need a third party, a weak little third party that would never win an election? So this looks like a shrewd move for a while to refuse to join a fledgling, weak abolitionist party, but not in 1850, when basically the Whig Party capitulates to the demands of the South. And now Stevens once again is high and dry, not the first time that he is politically. and so has to find a new home in political party terms.
And the Republican Party then founded in 1854, no? And this is around the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Some people describe the Kansas-Nebraska Act as putting the final nail in the coffin of the Whigs. And he joins the Republican Party.
I'm one of those people who thinks the Kansas-Nebraska Act was crucial in driving the nail into the Whig coffin. It wasn't the only issue, but it was absolutely crucial. And so this new party forms, made up initially of fragments of the Whigs, fragments of the Democrats, fragments of earlier abolitionist parties. In 1854, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act is introduced, and for the sake of your audience, let me explain that what's special about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it takes what eventually become Kansas and Nebraska, territories that, according to an earlier compromise, the 1820 Missouri Compromise, were supposed to be free of slavery. And it now opens them up to slavery by declaring that popular sovereignty, which had been popularized in the 1850 Compromise, will now be imported into this territory as well. And there is an enormous explosion of outrage in the North over this. It basically splits the Whigs and the Democrats wide open, especially the Whigs, but also an important wing of the Democrats, because it's a Democratic president who is endorsing this. And it is especially Democrats in Congress like Stephen Douglas, no relationship, of course, to Frederick, who are pushing this law. And so now there is the basis for not a fledgling, weak anti-slavery party, but a potentially powerful party, which is not an abolitionist party, which is not calling for the end of slavery, but at least is opposing the spread of slavery. And this becomes the issue of the 1850s. Stop slavery from spreading beyond its present boundaries, and have the federal government prevent it from spreading beyond its boundaries. And Thaddeus Stevens, like Lincoln and other Whigs, but also some Democrats, joined this party and set out to build it.
So by this point, Stevens is firmly in the abolitionist camp. The Civil War takes off. What is Stevens doing during the war? What are his interactions like with Lincoln? What kind of force is he within the Republican Party during this period?
I think it's important to start with the war before getting into Reconstruction, because the whole thing it's really one piece. What occurs in Reconstruction is an outgrowth of what takes place in the war. Stevens is the head of the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives, which is a particularly important position because it not only puts you in formal charge of the committee whose job it is to fund the federal government, but de facto, the chairman of that committee is a key floor leader of the Republican Party in Congress. So he's a key floor leader as a result of being the chairman of this committee. And he uses those positions, both as chairman of this committee and as a floor leader, to press for a more and more militantly anti-slavery war policy. When the war starts, Lincoln is not particularly interested in using this war as an instrument with which to do away with slavery. For Lincoln, this is a war, though Lincoln despises slavery. There's no question about that. But he doesn't see the war as an instrument with which to do away with slavery. What he wants to do is suppress secession, put the country back together again, so that the Republican Party can proceed with doing what it was doing before secession, which is gradually, peacefully doing away with slavery over the course of decades. Thaddeus Stevens and others, abolitionists, free blacks in the North, have a different attitude toward this. Let us do finally what we should have done long ago. Use the war brought on by the defense of slavery to uproot this monster that has been destroying our country ever since its foundation, bit by bit. And Stevens uses the threat posed by Southern armies to press for measures that eventually undermine slavery. So one is, for example, demand that Union armies confiscate slaves of Confederate slave owners, because the Confederate Army depends upon the labor of slaves in myriad ways. Who's driving the wagons? Who's cultivating the fields that feed the soldiers and that indeed feed the whole Confederate civilian population and make the war effort possible? Who's caring for the sick in Confederate hospitals? And the list goes on and on and on of ways in which slaves are strengthening the cause of the South. Not, of course, by choice, but because as enslaved individuals, they can be forced to do whatever their masters want done. People like Stevens say, let us take this weapon away from the South. And even individuals in Congress who are not abolitionists can see the logic of this. If you're for suppressing secession, you should be for confiscating slaves. And so, under the pressure of this threat and under the pressure of the logic of people like Stevens, the United States Congress does indeed begin to pass laws known as confiscation acts that do indeed legalize the confiscation of slaves. And then Stevens says we need to do more than this. Not only confiscate these slaves, but declare those slaves to be free. Now, it might seem that that would follow automatically, but there were a number of Northern legislators who did not see confiscation as equivalent to emancipation. Well, the slaves now belong to the North, and we'll have to decide what to do with them. Lincoln says, we don't want slaves. We want them free. And he demands that the United States grant effective freedom to these confiscated slaves. And that, too, eventually becomes Northern policy. And Stevens says, and we need to put black men from the North, where they're legally free, and the South, where they've been enslaved, we need to bring them into our armies. And initially, tremendous resistance, including by Abraham Lincoln, who thinks this is only going to lengthen the war by aggravating the South even further, enraging the South. Northern white soldiers will not agree because racism is not peculiar to the South. The North is, even when the North is hostile to slavery, it's still much of it quite racist. We may not want these people enslaved, but we don't want them as equals either. Becoming a soldier was viewed as a symbol of equality, as a position of honor. So the fear was that if the North puts black men in uniform as regular soldiers, white men will leave the ranks. But eventually that occurs. And by the end of the war, there are almost 200,000 black men having served in the Union Army or Navy. And this way of using the war as an argument in favor of greater and greater black freedom and more rights for African Americans keeps moving forward. And eventually, Stevens says, we need to do away with slavery, not only in the Confederacy, but throughout the United States. Because there are 4 states still in the Union where slavery is legal. And Stevens says we need to do away with slavery everywhere within the United States. And he says that, and he makes that demand a year before Abraham Lincoln comes around to the idea. But he does eventually come around to the idea. And of course, that's the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
And so the Civil War ends, this period Reconstruction begins, and the Republican Party is in power. I mean, it really just is the Republican Party at this point.
What happens in Reconstruction is similar to what happens during the war. Frederick Douglass says early in the war, the American people may not see it now, but the logic of events will prove to them that they have no choice but to attack slavery. And that's the leitmotif of everything that Thaddeus Stevens does, as we were just discussing during the war. The threat of the Confederacy and secession, destruction of the Union, becomes the motive force for the destruction of slavery too. But that doesn't end with the end of the war, because while there are many Northerners who say, fine, this is all done with, now let's just put the country back together again and proceed. And the Democratic Party's slogan is, the Constitution as it is, the Union as it was. So the war's over, let's just pick up where we left off in 1861. The problem is, in the elections of 1865 and 1866 in the South at the state level and the elections for Congress, Southern voters start sending Confederate leaders into the federal Senate the federal House of Representatives and the state legislators. And they used those positions at the state level to start passing laws to undermine emancipation. They were known as the Black Codes, and they enforced extremely onerous controls over Black people, including the right to take children away from Black families whom whites decided were not doing a proper job as parents, which meant anything that whites wanted it to mean, but also restricting where Black people could work, decreeing under what terms they could work, decreeing the level of wages, and laying out punishments for basically if you looked at white people the wrong way. If white people decided that you had behaved badly, you as a Black person were now subjected to physical punishment and imprisonment and, again, additional penalties. Well, the North is afraid, among other things, not only that the fact of emancipation is being undermined, but these people are going to link up with the Northern Democrats, and they are going to use their power at the federal level to once again start rolling back other things that we, the Republicans, have managed to pass during the war, such as internal improvements, a national bank, and protective tariffs for industry. Because all of that economic program that the Whigs had stood for was now imported into the Republican Party. And for Stevens, that was quite a good thing. But now the fear is that if the South is allowed to regain its complete power, and it will undoubtedly elect Democrats, and the Northern Democrats succeed in getting elected in parts of the North, they're going to find themselves in a majority. And everything that we have just fought for is going out the window. And that is why the Northern Republicans finds itself again, in many cases against its will, finds it necessary to begin not only imposing restrictions on the political rights of Southern whites, but also granting the vote to emancipated Black men in the South, something that was not part of the Emancipation Proclamation. But if we don't allow Black people to vote, it's only going to be the Confederates who are going to exercise the ballot. And so we need to do this in order to defend ourselves. Again, see the logic that continues over from the Civil War. We need to enfranchise Black people. It's the only way we're going to get loyal governments in the southern state capitals. It's the only way we're going to get decent people sent to the Congress. It's the only way we're going to hold on to the presidency.
You can just really see how Stevens, and there are some others as well, are continuing to push and basically saying, no, this is not the time to phone it in.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass said something like, the old snake will come forth in a new skin. And of course, he's right. He's right. Smart guy, Frederick Douglass.
Very much so. And then here's Johnson, too. There's a new president. And man, it's this period that I think is very interesting, in which those values, just picking up on what you said originally about what democracy meant to Stevens growing up, perhaps Stevens's family around the importance of the legislative branch. Here's Stevens finding that, well, he's working within a system in which the president, should they want to, Johnson, can veto what the legislative branch does.
And is doing that. Is doing
And
that
does do that.
repeatedly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Johnson is a thoroughgoing racist. Speaking of Frederick Douglass, Douglass saw that very early, prior to Lincoln's death. When in 1864, when Lincoln chooses Johnson, or at least the party chooses Johnson as Lincoln's running mate, and on Inauguration Day in 1865, Douglass is in the crowd and he looks at Lincoln and Johnson, and he looks particularly at Johnson, and Johnson looks down at him. And Douglass sees hatred in Johnson's face and says to the individual standing next to him, this is not our friend. And of course, he's right. And Johnson does what he can and exercises the power of the presidency to attempt to return the country to where it was before the war. And so every step that the Republican Congress takes that infringes on the rights of the white South, Johnson vetoes. And then the Republicans have to override the veto until finally, to jump ahead, it becomes what Johnson is doing becomes so egregious that the Republicans in the House impeach him. Just mention what I should have said earlier, which is the white South is not just passing restrictive racist laws. They're killing emancipated Black people who they identify as leaders of the Black population in the South. They're killing them, they're beating them, they're intimidating them. They're trying to make sure that they do not cast votes, do not run for office, do not break out of the constricted part of life that Southern whites have designed for them. And Stevens is very well aware of what's going on, constantly reminds the Congress of the bloody deeds taking place in the South. Andrew Johnson does absolutely nothing to prevent this reign of terror from proceeding. And indeed, when the Congress begins to empower Union soldiers, Union officers to protect Southern blacks, Johnson basically starts firing the Union Army officers in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau and in other ways exercising power in the South. And finally, therefore, Stevens and other like-minded members of his party convinced the party as a whole that they need to bring a bill of impeachment into the Senate and have a trial of Johnson. And as you say, and Stevens is not only one of the individuals who writes up the bill of impeachment, he's also one of the members of the Congress who enter the Senate and conduct the trial, who act as the prosecutor. But the Republican Party is not united. None of these political parties are homogeneous. And so even the Republican Party has got a conservative wing, a wing that got dragged kicking and screaming into some of the radical measures that they felt finally forced to adopt, but who are anxious now also to get the country back to sectional peace. Individuals like that refuse in the Senate to vote for impeachment. As you were saying, impeachment fails. It requires a 2/3 vote. So it gets a majority, but it doesn't get a 2/3 vote, and it's one vote shy. And so Andrew Johnson remains in office. Stevens flails about for a while trying to get the process of impeachment going again, but it's a gone goose.
Robert Caro's book on Lyndon Johnson, Master of the Senate, the book begins talking about that impeachment process and a real fear around what it would mean to actually kick out a president and what precedent this would set for the future, if it would weaken the power of the executive, so on and so forth. It's a real dramatic moment.
That's right.
I wanted to turn to how Stevens is remembered today. And then I want to ask you one more question. But how do folks remember Stevens today?
They don't. By and large, they don't remember Stevens. We're living at a time when history in general is taking a beating. The number of history majors is constantly dwindling in the universities. The people who are long out of school, but nonetheless historically minded and historically conscious, is also dwindling. One would have thought that the Spielberg movie about Lincoln that features Stevens, played by Tommy Lee Jones, would have revived a mass interest in Stevens. But I'm rather shocked how many times I ask people who, after they find out that I've written a biography of Stevens, and they say, "Who is Steve?" No author likes to hear that kind of a question, where the person talking to you makes it clear they have no idea who it is you're writing about. Well, I say, "Well, did you see the Lincoln movie?" And they say, "No." The number of educated, well-meaning, liberal-minded people who have not seen that movie never ceases to astound me. So he's not widely known to this date. And that's partly because over the course of years, starting in the post-Reconstruction era, people set out to blot Stevens out of national memory. And if he was to be remembered, to make sure he's remembered as a villain, not as a hero, for reasons that would take us, a whole other discussion to explain. When the North pulls back from Reconstruction, it pulls back from the memory of what the Civil War was about and pulls back from championing the Republican Party to which it once looked to defend the Union and to abolish slavery. So there's a deep conservatization that sets in the country as a whole. And in the course of that retreat from the principles and the goals and the values of emancipation and Reconstruction, Stevens is increasingly depicted as an ogre, as a wild extremist who is victimizing this poor, defenseless South. And you see this as late as John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, which got the Pulitzer Prize, by the way. and raised Kennedy's stature, a book that is still occasionally spoken of with admiration. It depicts Stevens in the same hostile way that Stevens had been showing up in novels and in movies like Birth of a Nation for many decades. And really, it's only after the rise and the accomplishments of the civil rights movement that the country as a whole begins to think differently in retrospect about the Civil War and Reconstruction. But Thaddeus Stevens' role in that is still something that most people have yet to learn. But there are individuals doing their best to bring Stevens' memory back to life and to bring him to popular attention. So, for example, the Lancaster History Organization in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, has been working to restore Thaddeus Stevens' home and office and turn it into a museum called the Thaddeus Stevens Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy. And they're going to turn that they're in the process of turning that into an educational institution, not only about Stevens and his assistant, Lydia Hamilton Smith, a woman of color, but also about the issues of the Civil War. And there's a Thaddeus Stevens Society based in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that does what it can to revive the memory of Stevens. And I do what I can to help them both. And I think that their work is very valuable, but it will be a big job.
You mentioned Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. That's a whole other discussion as well. How Reconstruction is remembered, how Du Bois was received, his struggles, so on and so forth.
Just to dot the I's and cross the T's, we're living in a time when the President of the United States and his cohort of allies are pulling books off the shelves of this type, are censoring those museums that they can lay their hands on, are trying to intimidate individuals who are talking about these issues and are trying to silence them. So there is a campaign against history going on. And if he can, we're going to see Donald Trump bringing back the Confederate statues that were in the last years finally taken down in the name of preserving history, even as he does his best to blot out those portions of history that he finds distasteful, such as discussions about slavery, discussions about what the Civil War was about, discussions about the civil rights movement, and on and on and on. So it's an uphill battle right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned that there wasn't a lot of Thaddeus Stevens talk and perhaps radical Reconstruction talk as you were growing up in the left. So I was curious if you think that bringing some of Stevens, some of this Reconstruction, Civil War history to today's left could help.
What Thaddeus Stevens shows us, among other things, is that positive change can happen, but it doesn't happen by itself. It's not simply the result of some inevitable, it's almost unnecessary to say this these days, considering the times we're living in, but there is no automatic process of human progress. The things we seek have to be fought for. Circumstances in which we live can either inhibit or abet the struggle for those things. So Stevens, in some periods of his life, was incapable of driving change forward. In other circumstances, enabled to do that. But you needed people like that. You needed leaders. You needed someone to get up and articulate what the logic of the situation was, to spell out what not everybody would understand were the needs of the time. You need a political party. You need writers, you need speakers, and you need courage. You need the willingness to stand up against the contrary pressures, to willingness to be in the minority, willingness to face physical threats, which Stevens repeatedly did, including on the floor of the House of Representatives. You need guts, and you need consistency, and you need determination, and you need allies, and you need not to fold up every time you're confronted with a danger of whatever kind. I think that's the most important thing. But also, revolutions can go backward. And so what you have won is not necessarily won for good and all. The achievements that you win have to be protected. Look at the way the Voting Rights Act has been stripped down right now. And all sorts of laws that we thought were protecting us, and rules that we assumed would protect us forever are now being discarded so easily. The things we fight for have to be fought for over and over again.
Well, I really appreciate you, Bruce, not only bringing us the history of Stevens, but also bringing us some of your own political development, allowing us to not only understand the history in Stevens's period, in Stevens's life, but also thinking about how more contemporary movements for change have and can and will continue to reckon with all these things.
Thanks. I'd like to think that history is relevant.
It absolutely is. Yeah. Be well.
Thank you, Luke.